Hi, today we're going to be talking about failure to launch and how it is involved in addiction and recovery for young adults. So today when we think about addiction and recovery, and specifically when we think about what brings young people into states of addiction, the landscape of drugs in our nation has changed quite a lot. We have a dramatically increased amounts of highly powerful prescription narcotics that are available to people. The THC in marijuana today is anywhere from 30 to 50 times higher than what it used to be. And we're seeing things like young adults having early onset psychosis from this. The new synthetic drugs that are out on the streets and that our young people are being faced with all the time have more question marks than answers. There's also the reality that we're coming through a pandemic, and that has impacted every aspect of our lives, and especially lives of adolescents and young adults. And the ideas that for a long time in our culture were even seem to have some consistency, like there are things you do in life. You go through high school, and then when you finish high school, you either get a job or you go to college, and more and more and more, those social norms are being questioned. And all of these things, along with a lot of other factors, contribute to a changed landscape. The bottom line is, being an adolescent and growing into adulthood, being a young adult today is different than it's ever been. So I want to talk about the groups of generational cohorts. So it's interesting because every generation is a little bit different. And to really understand this concept and how it's manifesting today, we've got to understand the idea of generational cohorts in general. So a generational cohort is when groups of people are born within specific time frames, and the things that are happening in the world at that time influence how they view the world. And it's a well-studied and understood phenomena that people from all sorts of different backgrounds, regardless of where you come from or your cultural background, that there is an impact on individuals' perception of the world that comes from the time frame in which you're born. We call those generational cohorts. So we can think of, if we go back to the cohort that was born between 1928 and 1945, right? They call this the silent generation. They call this, people who study it call them the good warriors. This is the World War II generation. And those were the things that really impacted them. Things like World War II, things like living in a culture where whoever is in charge, where authority was trusted. Then you've got the people who were born 1946 to 1964, right? They're the baby boomers, right? That's the hippie generation. That's the generation of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And they had things like, rather than having World War II, the thing that really impacted them was like Vietnam. And so these things change the way we view the world. And these tendencies to view the world differently persist for a long time. Moving on, you have my generation, right? I'm a Gen Xer, Generation X. And then if you go down to the youngest generations that we have, people talk a lot about the millennials. Remember that as of right now, the youngest or the oldest millennials are starting to get into their 40s. The next generation is Gen Z, right? Gen Z is this generation that's born between 1997 up to now. And what I want to talk about today really is the younger millennials and the Gen Z. And here are some of the things that have influenced their generational cohort, right? So they were raised in a time where violence and terrorism and drug overdose were normal realities of life. So as a Gen Xer, I grew up there had never, to my knowledge, I'd never heard of a school shooting. It didn't exist in my generation's childhood, didn't exist in our collective conscience. The young adults today, it's a norm from the time they have memory. Things like mass shootings and school violence, things like having to go through metal detectors in school, these are their norms. They tend to, and this is a great generalization, but they tend to have been raised by very nurturing parents, and they're drawn to family and for safety and security more than any other generation. They're the first generation to have what we call the helicopter parents. It doesn't mean that phenomenon never existed before, but where it is so common that it's actually given a title in our generation. And obviously the thing that people talk about a lot is the fact that this generation has grown up with technology in their hands from the time they have memory. If I talk to someone of this generation and tell them that there was no such thing as a cell phone when I was a kid, that's unfathomable. And when it's as strange as when somebody who is maybe of that great warrior generation says to me, we didn't have a TV. When we were kids, I couldn't imagine that. But this millennial generation and this Gen Z, their generational cohort is influenced by some very specific ideas. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about neurodevelopment. Now, it doesn't sound like fun, but stick with me, right? So when we talk about neurodevelopment, we're talking about the development of the brain. And old thinking was that, your brain is pretty much developed pretty close to the time that you're born. And then that got later and later, and people and scientists began to understand more and more. And so I remember being told that by the time you're 6 months old, your brain's developed. What we now know is that the human brain is not fully developed until we're generally into our mid-20s. And it's important because we're going back to that. Think about that, especially that changing landscape where drugs that are being introduced to the brains, they're being introduced to brains that are not yet fully developed when there's drug use in adolescence. And today, those drugs are more powerful than ever. So when we think about development, this is the first K. Brains are not even fully developed until an individual is in somewhere around their mid-20s. Yes, it is true that female brains are fully matured before males, not a shocker to anyone. Certainly, when we think about adolescence, what is adolescence? Well, adolescence, by definition, is the transition from a childhood to adulthood. And what's interesting about this is it has a biological onset. So when the human body becomes able to procreate, that's the onset of adolescence. It usually happens somewhere around the age of 11 to 13, somewhere around there. That changes. But the point is that the onset of adolescence is biological. It's when your body can procreate. But the outset of adolescence, when someone has moved from adolescence to adulthood, does not have a biological marker. It is a social marker. And so when we say that a person has moved from adolescence to adulthood, we say that there's 5 indicators that a person has moved from adolescence to adulthood. First of all, they have established autonomy. They are taking care of themselves. They have begun to have achievement in their lives. And so that's where high school graduation becomes very, very important, and people begin to get jobs. When we talk about achievement, it means that people begin to achieve their goals, whatever those goals are. They begin to establish an identity, and specifically an identity that is separate from their family. They may be super close to their family. They may be still living with their family. They may be not close to their family at all. It doesn't matter. It's, am I developing an identity that is unique to me, that is separate from my family? The ability to establish intimacy so I can have close, intimate relationships. And finally, the last marker that scientists talk about is developing a comfortability with one's own sexuality. And that doesn't mean that you have all the answers about sexuality solved, but what it means is that one becomes comfortable with seeing themselves as a sexual person. All of these things are really the markers of moving from adolescence to adulthood. So pause, especially if you're an adult, especially most people that are watching this are going to be professionals, and think about the times where you have made those transitions in your life. And what did it look like? It's never overnight. It's never a switch. But there is a point where you can say, I achieved those things. I established my autonomy. Now, in some cases, it's very possible for someone to enter adolescence, but never actually develop those skills for independent living, never actually hit any of those 5 markers necessary to move beyond adolescence and into adulthood. And this, when a person has not, when we would expect by their age for them to have developed that autonomy, and they haven't hit any of those markers, they're not developing the autonomy, and they are maybe a legal adult, but living as an adolescence, this is what is referred to as failure to launch. And I'll tell you, some people like that term and some people don't like that term, and it's okay. The key is understanding that there is a phenomenon where people remain stuck in adolescence. And so what are the things that impact that? So there are 4 big risk factors for this. First of all, substance use in childhood or early adolescence is a significant risk factor for increasing the likelihood that someone will fall into that failure to launch category. When there is childhood trauma or traumatic events or adverse events, these are positively correlated with failure to launch. When individuals have mental health conditions, sometimes those conditions can impact their ability to develop those and to hit those milestones. And in those cases, that actually can contribute to this. And finally, family systems sometimes are designed not to allow the development of independent living skills. And those are the 4 things that are correlated with, that make it more likely that someone will fail to move from adolescence into adulthood. Now, there's not any simple way to package exactly why this happens. There's not one reason. And in fact, if you see this or experiencing this, you're working perhaps with maybe a 25 or 30-year-old who has never moved out, never established autonomy, who's never gotten a job, who developed his or her own identity. It's important to assess each individual situation uniquely. And one of the ways we do this is through what's called the functional behavior analysis. And so what is it that what is the purpose for someone maintaining their life as an adolescent essentially, and not moving into adulthood? Well, that depends on the person. And when we think about this, we think about the functional behavior analysis, and we ask ourselves some questions. So some people have internal reasons that they that drive them to stay in adolescence. Other people have primarily external reasons. And sometimes it is reward and sometimes it's escape. So I want you to draw in your mind little 4 boxes. And one is internal reward. Sometimes people may stay in this adolescent state because it makes them feel better. It simply, there isn't a sense that I need to get out. There isn't a sense that I need to develop this autonomy. And so they feel comfortable. And so staying in that adolescent state is how it actually makes them feel internally comfortable. Some people, it's external reward. There are people, for example, who maybe get what they want and have everything provided for and have no motivation and want to stay where they're at. Sometimes people will stay in adolescence and the function is it's escape. Sometimes it can be an internal escape. The idea of going back to school, the idea of going to a job is so anxiety provoking that I stay here in adolescence in order to escape the anxiety. The bottom line is there are a lot of different driving factors. And so when we see failure to launch, we can't simply say that it is one thing or another without fully assessing the situation. This gets really complicated when a person also has a substance use disorder, and specifically when they have a severe substance use disorder, which we often refer to as addiction. This actually complicates the process of recovery. It is more challenging for the person with failure to launch to recover. They have more challenges than other people. And there's a few reasons why. One of the biggest things is the simple fact that anyone who has the disease of addiction, who has a condition where drugs of any kind have literally taken over their will, and they can't stop using, that's an incredibly deep and complicated, there's a lot to overcome. Recovery is life and death in those situations, and it involves work in every area of someone's life. But when someone who has failure to launch develops the disease of addiction, recovery for that person not only requires them to develop the skills to live life without drugs, but it also requires them to learn the basic living skills for independent living. So they have to learn essential independent living skills so that they can not only recover from addiction, but also really move on into adulthood. So if you're going to treat this population, treatment has to provide tools for not just that individual, but also for the whole family system. And these tools should help the family members learn how to effectively support their loved ones, both during and after treatment, but also learn how to give them room to develop dependence. Healthy support from family and friends and loved ones ultimately will increase the likelihood of success, but the key is that word healthy. So thinking about who's helping here, when you're treating the population, we have to understand that failure to launch occurs within the context of a family system. And addressing the family system is absolutely essential when addressing family to launch or failure to launch. The reason is that families are dynamic systems. They are influenced by changes that occur in and out of the system. And here's the deal. Families have a natural tendency to behave in such a way that they can maintain a sense of balance. People, families want to feel normal. Human beings want to feel normal. And so we have a tendency in family systems to operate in such a way as to maintain a sense of normalcy. And the problem is that sometimes our normal becomes unhealthy. And so in systems where failure to launch is part of the family dynamic, it is likely that if that young person who is still in that adolescent state, that when they do begin to get into adulthood, it's actually going to disrupt what we call family homeostasis. Even though the family wants them to grow and be well, that when they do, it actually disrupts and it feels weird and people want to feel normal. And so we have to understand that if we don't work with the entire family system, that inertia to be normal, when normal was with Joe over here failing to launch, they're actually going to be behaviorally pulling him back in unconsciously. So when we think about treating the family, we think about asking some questions. What are the rules in this family? What are the roles that different ones of us face? What are the costs of our rules and our roles? And what are the payoffs? These are the conversations that we have lovingly and gently and sometimes again and again with families as they discover. What are the rules? A rule may be that 25-year-old Johnny over here cannot do anything for himself. And so a role for Johnny is to play video games and not work. And a rule may be mom has to take care of everything. And so the role of mom is to take care of everything. And though there may be conflict, we have to examine those rules and those roles that exist in the family and then ask those questions honestly. What are the payoffs? What are the benefits of this? And Johnny may say, we may help him realize, I don't have to do anything. And mom may realize, or dad or sister or uncle or brother, I feel fulfilled. I feel like I've got a purpose. But then what are the costs of those rules? What are the costs of staying stuck in those roles? Helping families ask those hard questions and explore these things are critical for helping a young person with failure to launch really enter into and engage recovery. Looking at the individual. Knowing that we have to work with the whole family. But what are the questions for the individual? And I'd suggest that there's two really, really important questions. As a therapist, I've been a therapist for 20 years, and I can tell you that these are the most important. In fact, the first one is the most important question I ever ask a patient. What do you want? And a second question that is really, really important is what is missing? And it's interesting going back to thinking about the concept of the generational cohorts and how they actually, I can tell you that they answer these questions differently. Ultimately, with older persons, right, and people who have established themselves in life, really ultimately what human beings look for and what they want is peace. And we can do a whole nother talk on that another time. But this person who is in this adolescent state, the answer that has to come first before they can find peace is, and what they're really looking for is identity. I can't tell you how many people I see with like t-shirts or tattoos that say, "To thine own self be true." And if you ask, especially someone who's really struggling and they're still in adolescence and they can't get out of it. They may be in their 20s or even their 30s and they can't seem to get out of it. And you were to say they have that, that tattoo, to thine own self be true, and you say, who is thine own self? What is your identity? And what you find again and again is that they don't have it. It's not established. They're looking for it. So for us developing, for professionals who are working with folks, developing a concept of what identity means is really important. And this is where we can start to boil down what are the elements of treatment that are needed to help a person who has both addiction and may have co-occurring mental health conditions, but they also have this failure to launch. What are the actual things that they need? When we look at identity and what it is, I think there's 3 elements, and especially for this group of people. The elements of identity are function, purpose, and meaning. Function is, this is what you do. And in fact, I'd say pause for a second and ask yourself these questions about yourself as we go through them. What do you do? A lot of times, when we meet someone, what do? We say, hi, I'm John, and we chat for a minute. No, so what do you do, right? And we define ourselves a lot by what we do. And sometimes I've heard people refer to that as a negative thing, and it can be a negative thing if that's where you stop. But the reality is, what I do actually is a big part of my identity. And that's okay, and that's normal, but it's not the whole. So think about that. What is your function? What do you do? And then, what is your purpose? How do you fit into the scheme of this world, into the scheme of your world? So if I were to talk about my function, I might talk about being a therapist or a researcher or a scientist or a teacher. I might talk about things that I do. And then when you ask me about purpose, I would talk about being, a father and being a husband. I would talk about, wanting to help others and mentor people and how I fit in my main relationships with my friends and family. And so there's function and there's your purpose, but then there's also meaning. Why does any of this matter? Why does that function, what I do, matter? Does how I fit in the world and with those around me, why does it even matter? That's the deeper question. And what's important in this, and again, I hope that you'll think about, what about me? How would I answer those questions? What's my function? What's my purpose? What do I do? How do I fit? But then ask about meaning. And what does it matter? And what I would say is this: people will have a wide range of answers here. Some people will have very deep spiritual or religious or reasons, and others will have completely different ways of looking at things. It's not important to be able necessarily to articulate in words why it all matters, but for identity to be really formed, there has to be a sense that it does all matter. And so the function, what I do, understanding that's important, how I fit's important, and what matter, why this matters. And so developing all 3 of those areas is what makes up identity. So how do we help someone who has failure to launch and is struggling to enter recovery from addiction, maybe has comorbid mental health conditions? How do we help them do that? So let's break it up into those 3 areas. So first of all, function. Well, what we do is we actually you have to provide these people life skills training. And so literally it is about providing basic skills for planning meals, for cooking, for managing their own money, for considering what they want to do vocationally or educationally, and actually taking steps towards it. Simple things like time management, exercises in responsibility, giving them opportunities to care for themselves, and even giving them opportunities to be of service to others. All of these tasks are the tasks of developing, helping someone develop a concept of function. What do I do? The next is purpose. How do I fit? And so this is done by providing interpersonal development. So when you're treating this is best treated in community. And so programs that or efforts to treat this phenomena, failure to launch is not best treated by sitting with an individual therapist once or twice a week in their office, but actually by getting into community, by experiencing citizenship. I was talking to someone recently about being part of the Chamber of Commerce. There are so many opportunities to involve oneself in a meaningful way, but these young people, they don't have that. And so treating this condition means that we help them engage those opportunities for community living, for citizenship, for fulfilling family obligations, developing abilities to work in teams. Group therapy is the preferred modality here. And again, opportunities for service. So opportunities for service, there's going to be a theme here. They help build identity in function, in purpose, and finally in that third area of meaning. So if we're going to help a person develop identity, we have to address all of these areas, including this meaning area. And so what does that mean? It means that we intentionally help them explore the transcendent aspects of the human experience. And it can sound kind of woo-woo to say it that way, but the reality is much of what we value, much of what is important to us is transcendent. So think about the last time. When was the last time that you were in awe of something? When was the last time you said, wow? That's transcendence. When I went to Moab, Utah, and I first saw the LaSalle Mountains in the background of these incredible, this desert, and I was filled with awe. So helping people develop and explore the transcendent aspects of life, whether they do it through spiritual practice, whether they do it through engaging nature, whether they do it through intentionally finding moments of awe, and also when they do it through service. Working with this population, helping any human being find meaning, service to others is integral. And so even thinking about your own life, times where you have been able to be of service to others, it's part of your function. It's part of what I do. It's part of your purpose. It's how I relate to others. But there's something that happens. Can you think of a time in your life where you were able to give to others, to serve others, and something happened in you? These are the things that help to build identity. So in summary, the landscape of growing up, the landscape of moving from adolescence into adulthood is changing. It changes for all generational cohorts, but in particular right now, it's perfectly set to increase this phenomena where we see young people who enter adolescence but stay there beyond the normal time of moving into adulthood. Adolescence has a biological onset, but it has a social outset, and people enter adulthood when they develop independence. When we're working with people who have addiction and who have this failure to launch, we need to treat both, because otherwise, after treatment, they will still have be stuck in adolescence if we haven't. And in order to treat this, we do it in community, and we help people develop identity, which is their purpose, their meaning, and their function. Thank you.